I gave them the key to my family cabin as a gift. One weekend, I showed up unannounced to drop off firewood. My daughter-in-law opened the door and said, "This isn't your place anymore, don't come here again." My son said, "Give us space." I nodded, but she didn't know I'd installed a motion camera and what that footage captured would soon. I walked into that cabin thinking I was doing something generous, thinking I was the kind of father who gave without asking for anything in return. I was wrong about almost everything that day, but I didn't know it yet. The firewood was heavy in my arms, pine-scented and still cold from the stack on the porch, and I was feeling almost proud of myself for making the drive up the mountain just to help. Then the door swung open and Elise was standing there like a wall, her arms loose at her sides but her eyes sharp as wire. "This isn't your place anymore," she said. "Don't come here again." I didn't move. The words hit me somewhere behind my ribs and just sat there. Behind her, Caleb was doing that thing he does where he stares at the floor like he's reading something written on the wood. "Dad," he muttered, "just give us space." I looked at my son for a long moment. I wanted him to look up. He didn't, so I set the firewood down on the porch boards like I was leaving flowers at a grave, turned around and walked back to my truck. I didn't say a single word, but my jaw was clenched so tight my back teeth ached the whole drive home. My name is Daniel Harper. I am 68 years old. I have been a widower for 3 years, and I have spent the better part of those 3 years convincing myself that giving things to people is the same as loving them. My late wife Martha used to say I treated generosity like a currency, that I kept invisible ledgers in my head and got quietly furious when the balance came back wrong. She was right and I knew she was right, and I kept doing it anyway because some habits are carved so deep they feel like bone. I am stubborn in the way that old trees are stubborn, the kind that don't bend in storms, they just splinter. I had given Caleb and Elise the use of Martha's cabin not just out of kindness but out of strategy, though I never would have admitted that to anyone, including myself. I wanted them close. I wanted to matter to them. I wanted the gesture to buy something, and I wanted it badly enough that I dressed the whole thing up in the language of pure generosity and served it to myself like medicine. The cabin was up in the mountains of western North Carolina, 2 hours from the house where I'd raised Caleb, all dark wood and stone fireplace, and the particular smell of cold air mixed with cedar that Martha had loved more than almost anything. I had given them access to something sacred, and then 3 months later I had installed a small motion-activated camera in the corner of the main room near the bookshelves, because there had been a break-in at a neighboring property and I told myself it was for safety. I told myself that every single day. That night after Elise turned me away from the porch, I sat in my kitchen with a glass of water I never touched, and I opened the security camera application on my phone. The footage was time-stamped. I scrolled back through the last several weeks telling myself I was just checking that the property was secure, that nothing had been damaged, that my investment was intact. Then I saw him. The man appeared first at the edge of the frame, and what stopped me cold was not that he was there but how comfortable he looked. Not like a visitor, like someone who had been invited. Elise was laughing in a way I had honestly never seen before, open and easy and without that careful layer of politeness she always wore around me. "You are imagining things," I said out loud to myself in my empty kitchen, but I kept watching. The man was maybe in his early 40s, lean and calm-looking, with the kind of deliberate posture that made me think he was used to being in rooms where things were emotionally complicated. He appeared on multiple evenings, always on nights when Caleb's truck wasn't in the gravel turnout, wine on the table, music playing low, conversation that the camera picked up in fragments, not enough to understand fully, just enough to make me fill in the blanks with the worst possible interpretation. And I filled them in eagerly because I am that kind of man. I should have called Caleb immediately, I know that. Any reasonable father sees footage like that and picks up the phone and says, "Son, I need to talk to you." But I didn't, and the reason I didn't is something I have had to sit with for a long time since. Part of it was that I wanted to be sure. Part of it was that I wanted more information before I acted, because I have always believed that information is power and that power protects me. But the real reason, the one I circled around for weeks before I could name it, was this: I was angry at Caleb too, not just at Elise. Caleb had let her turn me away from that porch. He had stood there staring at the floor while his wife spoke to me like I was a trespasser on my own family's land. That anger lived in me like an ember, and I didn't want to put it out by rushing in to rescue him. I wanted to hold it. I wanted to be right about something, even if being right was going to hurt everyone. So instead of calling, I drove back up the mountain. I parked down the road, back behind a bend where the trees were thick enough to hide a truck, and I sat there in the dark with the heater running and the camera application open on my phone, watching the live feed. The cabin windows glowed warm and yellow against the black mountain night. I told myself I was gathering evidence. I told myself I was being methodical. What I was actually doing was feeding something ugly inside myself, and I was enjoying it more than I should have. "You are protecting your son," I said to my reflection in the rearview mirror, and my reflection did not look convinced. I watched for 2 hours. The man was there. They were talking in the main room. I couldn't make out the words on the live feed, but the body language read as intimate to me. and I cataloged every detail with the focused misery of a man who has decided to be a martyr. When I finally drove home, I had built a complete story in my head that had very little to do with what was actually happening. The night the argument erupted, I almost missed it. I had fallen asleep in my recliner with the phone on my chest, and the motion alert woke me at a few minutes past 10. I fumbled with the screen and got the feed open just in time to hear Caleb's voice coming through the speaker, cracked and high in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. "What is he doing here?" The camera picked up movement, 2 figures, then 3, the geometry of a confrontation. I sat straight up in my recliner. Elise's voice came back. Lower than Caleb's but harder, the way low things can be harder than loud ones. "Maybe if you weren't so busy pushing everyone away." Then there was a sound like glass hitting a wall, a brief roar of static, and the feed dropped for several seconds. When it came back, the third figure was gone. Caleb was sitting on the couch with his head in his hands. The angle caught his shoulders shaking. My son was crying. And I was watching from 2 hours away through a hidden camera, feeling something that took me a long time to identify. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even vindication. It was shame, but not enough shame to stop me from what I did next. I went back the following morning. I didn't call ahead. I didn't knock. I told myself that I owned this property, that I had the right to check on it, that I was concerned after the sounds of breaking glass on the camera feed. I told myself a lot of things. The door was unlocked when I pushed on it, which I registered as slightly strange, and the air inside was different. The way a room feels different after a hard conversation has taken place in it, heavier somehow, like the words are still hanging around. "Elise, Caleb," I called out. The echo came back empty. I stepped into the main room and scanned the shelves out of habit, the way you glance at something you've been watching for weeks. Then I saw the corner bracket where the camera had been mounted. Bracket was still there. The camera was not. My pulse jumped. "Looking for this." Caleb stepped out from the hallway. He was holding the device between 2 fingers loosely, like it was something he had found in the trash and was presenting as evidence of my character. His eyes were the red and hollow kind that come from crying yourself to sleep, and then waking up still tired. He looked older than 38 in that moment. He looked like a man who had spent the night deciding how to feel about his father. "You were watching us," he said. It wasn't a question. I opened my mouth. The justifications were all there, lined up and ready. The break-in at the neighboring property, the need for security, the fact that I owned the place, the fact that I was worried. Not a single word of it came out, because Caleb's eyes were asking a different question underneath the words, a question that sounded like, "Did you ever actually trust me?" "Caleb," I started. "I just know," he said, and he said it quietly, which was worse than if he had shouted. "Don't." Elise appeared in the doorway behind him. She had her arms crossed, and her expression wasn't angry the way I expected. It was something closer to tired. The kind of tired that comes from being right about something you didn't want to be right about. "We knew something was off," she said, "so we checked." "I found it 3 days ago," Caleb said. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you ever since." I looked at my son, and I could see him rearranging his face, putting the composure back piece by piece, and it reminded me so painfully of Martha that I had to look away. She used to do the same thing when she was really hurt. She put herself back together in front of you so you wouldn't have to see all the pieces. "You didn't give us the cabin," Caleb said. His voice was flat and steady now, the way a voice gets when it's protecting itself. "You just changed the way you controlled us." "That's not Dad." He set the broken camera down on the kitchen counter with a click. "I found the app on your phone 2 months ago when you left it at the house. I didn't say anything because I kept hoping I was wrong about what I was seeing." I felt the floor shift under me slightly. "You've known," I said. "For 2 months you've known," he nodded slowly. "And I kept watching you," he said, "waiting to see if you would come clean, waiting to see if you would tell me." He looked at me for a long moment. "You didn't." That landed differently than any of the other things he had said, because it wasn't about Elise, and it wasn't about the man on the camera, and it wasn't even really about the cabin. It was about who I was. It was about the fact that my son had given me 2 months to be better than I was, and I had spent those 2 months in my truck in the dark, watching a live camera feed and feeling righteous about it. Lise moved into the room then, not aggressively but with a kind of quiet authority, and sat down in one of the wooden chairs by the fireplace. She looked at me directly, which I realized she almost never did. I had always read her wariness around me as coldness, as disdain, but sitting there looking at me, I understood something different. She was careful around me because she didn't feel safe, not in a physical sense, emotionally safe. "The man you saw," she said, "on the camera. You want to know who he is?" I stood very still. "His name is Dr. Adrian Voss," she said. "He is a marriage counselor. We have been seeing him twice a month. We asked him to come here because we wanted a session in a neutral space, somewhere neither of us associated with daily stress." She paused. "We didn't tell you we were in counseling because every single time Caleb tells you something personal, you turn it into something about yourself. We couldn't afford to do that with this." The silence in the room was enormous. I heard wind moving through the trees outside, heard the old wood of the cabin settling, heard my own breathing. "A counselor," I said. Caleb exhaled. "Yeah, Dad, a counselor. We've been trying to save our marriage, not that you asked." I thought about the hours I had spent watching that footage, the narratives I had constructed, the righteous fury I had nursed. the cold mountain nights in my truck down the road. All of it built on a foundation of my own suspicion and my own need to be the person who knew things, who held power, who mattered. I thought, I started. I know what you thought, Elise said, and her voice had gone softer, which was somehow harder to take than the firmness. You thought the worst, and then you sat on it and watched. You didn't come to us, you didn't ask, you just collected it. I was going to. When? Caleb asked. When were you going to come to us? I didn't have an answer. Caleb sat down on the edge of the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and he looked at his hands for a moment the way he used to do when he was a boy working through something complicated. Do you know why I stopped talking to you about my life? He asked quietly. I waited. Because every time I told you something it became your crisis, he said. I told you Elise and I were having a hard year and you started calling her family. I told you I was stressed at work and you showed up at my office with a box of food like I was incapable. I told you about a disagreement we had once, one disagreement, and you brought it up for the next 3 years. He looked up at me. You never asked how to help. You just decided. I thought about Martha again. She had said something similar once, softer, framed as a gentle observation, and I had been slightly wounded by it and then filed it away and gone on exactly as before. I was beginning to understand that this was a pattern in me as thick and old as the rings in a tree trunk. Dad, Caleb said, I love you, I want to be clear about that, but you have to understand what it's been like. He took a slow breath. Mom used to buffer it. She would translate you for us. She would explain what you meant when what you said landed wrong. She would call me after and say, your father didn't mean it that way, he just doesn't know how to say things. When she died, that buffer went away, and you got harder, more intense, more convinced that if you gave us enough things, we would owe you something. I never asked you for anything, I said, and even as I said it, I heard how it sounded. I heard the ledger in it. That's the thing, Elise said. You didn't ask, you just expected, and when we didn't perform gratitude the right way, you found other ways to stay close, the surprise visits, the gifts we didn't ask for, and then a camera in our private space. She shook her head slowly. You never asked us what we needed, not once. Those words settled into me the way cold does from the outside in. I looked around the cabin, at Martha's books still on the shelves, at the fireplace she had picked out from a catalog 20 years ago, at the quilt folded over the arm of the couch that she had made herself one winter. I had given this place to Caleb and Elise like I was giving them a piece of Martha, like the gesture could do the work of grief that I hadn't been willing to do, like it could make them love me the way she had. And instead I had put a camera in the corner and watched them from 2 hours away, telling myself I was keeping them safe. They didn't ask me to leave this time. They just sat there, both of them quiet and spent, and I understood that the silence was not anger anymore. It was waiting. They were waiting to see what I would do with all of it, whether I would argue, justify, deflect, or walk out and call my brother and spend the next 3 weeks explaining how they had disrespected me. I was capable of all of those things, and some part of me wanted to do all of them because they were easier than standing there in the cabin where my wife used to be happy and accepting that I had hollowed something out. I'm sorry, I said. And I meant it in the particular way that people mean it when they are sorry for more than one specific thing, when the apology is trying to cover a landscape so wide they can't even see the edges. Caleb looked up. I know, he said after a moment. That's the hard part. I know you are. I walked to the door. Elise didn't move. Caleb watched me go. I stepped out onto the porch where the firewood I'd left days earlier was still stacked in its bundle, and I stood there for a moment in the cold mountain air, breathing it in, the pine and the altitude and the particular silence of a place that has absorbed years of a family's history. Then I got in my truck and drove home. The weeks that followed were the quietest of my life. I deleted the camera application from my phone on the drive back down the mountain, pulled it off while I was stopped at a red light, and felt something release in my chest when the icon disappeared. I deleted the stored footage too, all of it, the weeks of clips I had watched and rewatched, the fragments of conversation I had misread, the moments of someone else's private life that I had consumed like they belonged to me. I sat in my kitchen a lot. I am not someone who naturally gravitates toward sitting still. I have always been a doer, a fixer, a man who shows up with firewood and groceries and solutions, and the absence of that motion was disorienting. I called my brother Raymond twice and talked around the edges of what had happened without actually saying it. I called my doctor and got a referral I had been putting off for 2 years and had my knee looked at. Small, quiet things, things that had nothing to do with anyone but me. I thought about Martha constantly. I thought about the way she used to touch my arm when I was gearing up for a confrontation and say, Daniel, just listen first. I had always nodded like I understood and then done exactly what I had already decided to do. I wondered what she would think of the man I had become in the 3 years since she died. I did not wonder comfortably. I started seeing a therapist in the city, a woman named Dr. Patricia Sohn who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the kind of practiced stillness that I associated with people who had spent decades listening to difficult men work through their own stubbornness. She did not tell me I was a bad person. She did something harder. She asked me questions I had been avoiding for 68 years, and then sat quietly while I ran out of ways to dodge them. When you installed the camera, she said one afternoon, what were you afraid of? I had a ready answer, the break-in at the neighboring property, the safety of the cabin. She waited, the ready answer dried up. I was afraid they didn't need me anymore, I said. It came out smaller than I expected. She nodded. And if they didn't need you, what did that mean? I stared at the plant on her windowsill for a long time. That I wasn't part of the family, I said. She nodded again. Has that always been a fear? She asked. Losing your place in things. I thought about my father, who had also given things instead of saying things, who had funded my college and shown up to my wedding and sat stiffly through every important moment of my life with a face that said he loved me but no words that confirmed it. Yeah, I said, I think so. She didn't fill the silence after that. She was good at silence in a way that I was learning, slowly and against my nature, to respect. I did not call Caleb during those weeks. Not because I was angry, I wasn't anymore, but because Elise had said something that had worked its way into me and kept surfacing at odd hours. She had said I never asked what they needed, and what they had said most clearly, both of them, was that they needed space. So I tried to give them actual space, not the kind of space that is just a pause before the next phone call, not the kind where I was still circling, but the real kind where I stepped back far enough that they couldn't see me waiting. It was one of the hardest things I had done in years. I am not built for patience. I am built for action, for showing up, for the visible gesture. Sitting on my hands while my son processed something difficult felt like standing outside in winter without a coat, every instinct screaming that this was wrong, that I should be doing something. But I had enough clarity by then to understand that my instincts in that department were exactly what had caused the problem. I started going through Martha's things. I had been putting it off since she died, leaving her side of the closet intact, her books where she'd left them in the living room, her reading glasses still folded on the nightstand. I had told myself it was too painful to deal with. But sitting in my quiet kitchen with no camera to watch and no plans to drive up the mountain and no gestures to make, I finally understood that I had been keeping her things in place not just out of grief, but out of the same impulse that put the camera in the cabin. Control. If nothing moved, time didn't move. If I kept everything where she left it, I could maintain the feeling that she was still nearby, that I was still the person she had known and buffered and translated for the people who loved him. But she was gone, and I was the person who remained, and I was going to have to figure out who that person was without using her memory as a way to avoid the question. I folded her clothes carefully. I boxed her books. I put her reading glasses in a small dish on my dresser, because some things you keep not out of avoidance but out of love. It took 3 days and I cried more than I expected to, the ugly kind of crying that doesn't look dignified, and I didn't call anyone while I was doing it. I just let it happen. 6 weeks after the morning in the cabin, a package arrived at my door. It was a small, padded envelope, my name written on it in Caleb's handwriting, which I would know anywhere. I stood in my doorway holding it for a moment before I opened it. Inside was a key, a single brass cabin key on a plain ring, and a note folded once, Caleb's handwriting again, straightforward and without decoration. If you ever want to come back, knock first. I read it 3 times. I sat down at my kitchen table and held the key in my palm and felt its weight, which was nothing, a few grams of metal, but which felt in that moment like something much heavier. It was not a restoration. I understood that clearly. It was not a return to how things had been before, because how things had been before had built toward a hidden camera and a confrontation in a cabin, and my son holding the broken device between 2 fingers like evidence of who I was. The key was something smaller and also something larger. It was a door left open, an invitation to try being different. I didn't go that week. I didn't call Caleb either, though I thought about it often. I was learning, awkwardly and too late and better than never, the difference between reaching out because I needed something and reaching out because I had something to offer. And what I had to offer right now was still thin. I was still in the early stages of understanding what I had done and why, still in the early work of building different habits, still the kind of man who had to consciously remind himself to ask a question instead of supplying an answer. Patricia had said in our last session that change at my age was not impossible, but it was slow, and that the people I loved were not required to wait for it, but that some of them might choose to, and the best thing I could do was make sure the change was real and not just a new kind of performance. You've spent your whole life performing care, she had said. Now you have to figure out what it actually feels like to give it without an audience. It landed hard, because the camera, when I thought about it that way, was the most literal version of a thing I had been doing my whole life. I had been performing care, and I had wanted to watch my own performance reflected back in the gratitude of the people I loved, and when that gratitude didn't come the way I needed it to, I had found other ways to keep myself central. The camera was just the version where the watching became literal. Martha had known this about me and had loved me anyway, and in doing so she had also enabled me, smoothed my edges for everyone around me, translated my control into something that looked like devotion. And Caleb had grown up watching that, had grown up with a father whose love always came attached to something, always had a weight to it, always kept a ledger. He had married a woman strong enough to name it, and they had gone to counseling together to try to build something healthier, and I had watched them through a camera and thought I was the wronged party. The full shape of it was not flattering. One Sunday, about 2 months after the package arrived, I drove up to the mountain. I didn't call ahead. I know how that sounds, I know, but I had thought about it carefully, and what I decided was this. I was not going to surprise them. I was going to stop at the gravel turnout at the bottom of the road, which is visible from the cabin porch, and I was going to sit there for a while. And if Caleb or Elise saw my truck and wanted to come down, I would be there. If they didn't, I would drive home. I parked in the turnout and turned the engine off and sat with the windows down, listening to the mountain, wind in the hemlocks, a woodpecker somewhere in the trees above, the particular cold, clean smell of that altitude that I associated with every good thing Martha had ever loved about that place. I sat there for about half an hour, then I heard boots on gravel. Caleb came down the road alone, hands in his jacket pockets, not hurrying. He stopped at the passenger side of the truck and looked at me through the open window. He looked like himself, my son, with Martha's eyes and my jaw and 38 years of accumulated becoming that had very little to do with me anymore. "You didn't knock," he said. There was almost something in his voice that could have been a beginning of amusement. "I didn't come to the door," I said. He looked at the cabin, then back at me. "You want to come up?" he asked. I thought about it. Really thought about it, the way I was trying to think about things now, slowly and with actual consideration of the other people involved. "Not today," I said. "I just wanted to drive up, wanted to be near it for a minute." Caleb nodded slowly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, looked at it for a second, and then put it back. "Elise is starting to make lunch," he said. "You could come up. We're okay if you want to." "Maybe next time," I said, "if that's all right." He looked at me for a long moment. "Yeah," he said, "that's all right." He knocked twice on the roof of the truck, the way he used to do when he was a teenager, borrowing my car, a habit so old I had forgotten it existed, and then he walked back up the road. I watched him go. I sat in the truck for another few minutes listening to the mountain. Then I started the engine and drove home. I didn't look at my phone the whole way, I just drove. Some nights I still think about what I would have missed if I had never installed that camera, if the footage had never existed, if I had stayed in my lane and let Caleb and Elise manage their own marriage without my surveillance. The honest answer is that I would have missed the confrontation that broke things open. And as much as that morning in the cabin cost me, as much as standing there watching my son hold my broken camera was one of the worst moments of my adult life, I needed it. I needed to be caught. I needed someone to stop letting me be the version of myself that smiled while it kept score, that gave while it withheld, that loved while it watched. Martha had been too kind to do it. I had needed my son and his quietly formidable wife to do it instead, and they had, and I was trying every day to deserve the key they had sent me. I haven't gone back to the cabin yet. I have called Caleb 4 times in the last 2 months, short calls, checking in, asking how things are going, and then actually listening to the answer without turning it into something about me. The last time he laughed at something I said, a real laugh, not a polite one, and I held on to that for days. Lise texted me once to ask if I had a recipe of Martha's, a specific apple cake Martha used to make at the cabin in October, and I found it in the recipe box and photographed it and sent it to her and didn't add anything else. No explanation, no commentary, just the recipe. She sent back a single photograph 2 days later, the finished cake on the cabin table, the fireplace visible in the background, October light coming through the window the way it always had. I printed it and put it on my refrigerator. The key lives on my kitchen counter now next to Martha's glasses. I look at it most mornings, not with urgency, not with the old hunger to do something with it, but with something quieter. I am learning that belonging to people is not the same as possessing them. I am learning it slowly, the way old wood learns new shapes, with resistance, with time, and with the gradual acceptance that the grain of you has to change before anything else can.